Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. December 1916. The gray skies above eastern France. Eugene Bullard pulls the flight control stick on his Spod 7 biplane, dropping into a steep dive through the clouds. He can see his wingman trying to shake off a German Fokker, and Bullard needs to get in there to help his comrade. Bullard was born in Georgia, but moved to Paris a few years ago to seek a new life as a boxer, comedian, and jazz drummer. Wounded on the ground at Verdun, he now fights in the air. He's flown nearly 20 combat missions over the past 2 months. He did not do this to become the first African-American fighter pilot in history, though that's what he is. He did it to defend his newly adopted homeland against German invasion. His plane is painted with a stylized heart with a dagger running through it, underscored with the phrase, "All blood runs red." A burst of machine gun fire gets the enemy aircraft's attention, and the Fokker breaks off its attack and takes an evasive maneuver. With the frigid wind whipping at his face, Eugene Bullard fights the control stick, banks his aircraft hard, and drops in behind the enemy airplane. He lines his iron sights up for a shot and squeezes the thumb trigger on his .303 caliber Vickers machine guns. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am joined once again by writer and producer Brandon Fibbs. Brandon, thank you so much for being back on the show. It's always great to have you here and to talk to you.
Thank you for joining, or I should say thank. What am I saying? Let's start that again. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, you had been on the show a few times. We've talked about largely aviation badasses. We talked about the Apollo 11 mission, which you had done an entire podcast series on. And then last time we did the Night Witches.
You're right. We're like kind of carving a little aviation groove here, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, it helps because you were a pilot in the Navy, or you worked on an airplane in the Navy.
I wasn't a pilot. I always tell people that I was a combination of Goose from Top Gun and Jonesy from The Hunt for Red October. My job was to track submarines from S-3 Vikings, so I sat directly behind the pilot and worked the radar and sonar and a bunch of other controls. So I was the guy going, "Crazy Ivan, Crazy Ivan."
Yeah, when you said Jonesy, my first thought was Alien, the cat in Alien.
Oh yeah, that's a good one too.
That's an interesting job to have on the Navy.
I'll redo that. So I was the guy in the back of the plane going, "Meow, meow."
That's still more aviation experience than I have. So I fly on airplanes a lot. I do a lot of traveling, but I don't ever. They never put me in control of anything.
It's not as exciting when you're not strapped to an ejection seat. Let me tell you.
Yes, I believe that. I don't even like to put the seat back down when I'm sitting on the plane because I don't want to squish the person behind me.
Very conscientious of you.
We are talking about another aviation badass this week.
Yes, we are.
You had suggested a person that is really an unsung badass from American military history.
Yes.
And when I saw the name on your list, you'd sent me a big list of people you thought we could talk about. And this is a guy that I had I'd written about way long time ago on my website. But really just an incredible story from aviation history. So Brandon, who are we talking about today?
We are talking about Eugene James Bullard.
Yes, Jacques Bullard. I've seen it sometimes too.
Yes, so he changed his name after we'll get into the story later. But yeah, he was born Eugene James, but then after spending a lot of time in France, he decided, hey, I'm going to upgrade my name.
Yeah, that's a good upgrade. I like
that. Is a good upgrade.
Bullard. That's better. But he was the first African-American fighter pilot in U.S. history, even though he didn't.
Decades before the Tuskegee Airmen.
Mm-hmm. Even though he didn't fly for the U.S., he flew for France for reasons we are going to get into in the future. Yeah. But his nickname is awesome. His nickname was the Black Swallow of Death, which I love. Okay.
I did not have that cool of a name when I was in the military. I'll have to let you know that. I'll confess that right off the bat.
Did you get a call sign? Because sometimes, I don't know if that's just a fighter pilot thing.
Oh, no. Yeah, we absolutely all had call signs. And because I was always the guy talking politics, my nickname was Senator, or my call sign was Senator.
Oh, that's...
And the thing is, you can't assign your own call signs. They
Right.
have to be picked by your squadron. And so, yeah, since I was always the guy talking about politics, Senator was my call sign.
That could be worse, because there's a website out there. It's like the F-16 Pilots Association or something. They have a thing on their website that I go to sometimes to look at because it's fun. They have a list of all the call signs. People go on there and they put a call sign, their call sign, or a call sign that they knew from somebody they served with, and then the explanation as to why they had that. And a lot of them are unflattering.
Yes. Oh, yeah. You really don't want to do something embarrassing in your training, to earn a really bad one, because that is going to stick with you for your entire career.
Yeah. People 20 years later will be asking, why did they call you that? And you have to recount this embarrassing story that happened to you. So as far as that goes, Senator's not bad. I like it.
Yeah. No complaints. No complaints. I'm still that guy.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Senator's cool, but it's not quite the black swallow of death. We are going to take a really quick commercial break. And when we get back, we are going to talk about an unsung war hero, American war hero who fought not just in the skies above World War I, but also on the ground, and also on the ground of World War II. So real, and that's just kind of the beginning of his story. It gets wild, and you need to stick with us to hear this, because Eugene James Bullard is going to have a wild ride in his life. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Badass of the Week. We are back with Brandon Fibbs, and we are going to tell the story of Eugene Bullard. So, Brandon, why don't you get us started with the backstory of this amazing character?
You bet. And this is one of those stories. This is one of those characters that I don't understand why more people don't know him, and why his name and his exploits aren't better known. And mostly because the things that we're talking about, his like aviation exploits, aren't even all of his exploits. This is a man who at no point in his life wasn't engaged in some extraordinary enterprise that made him worthy of us talking about him at every stage of the game. So he's born in 1895 in Columbus, Georgia. His father's an ex-slave. He's the 7th of 10 children, and he was very poor. And one of his seminal events as a child was when he was 11 years old, or roughly thereabouts. A white mob beat and attempted to hang his father. And it crystallized something in him in terms of just being really disillusioned with the country of his birth. And even as a small child, he just wanted to escape racial discrimination. And his father had been telling him stories about how in France they'd long ago abolished slavery and blacks were treated the same as whites. And even as a young kid, he fantasized about escaping the United States and getting overseas to France, which is actually something that at 11 years old, he kicked off. He ran away from home at 11 years old with the intent to get to France, which...
Impressive. Yeah. 11 years old, running away from home. My understanding is that his home life was not super happy in general across the board. Like you said, a really difficult life growing up in a lot of ways. But yeah, to kind of run away at 11 is pretty hardcore. To go to
pretty
France.
Hardcore. I mean, I can't imagine doing it at 16 or 17 or any other age, but at 11?
I got friends that are like in their 30s and they haven't run away from home yet.
Yeah, that's right. So true. The crazy thing is, though, of course, like you're not going to get to France without a lot of money or a ticket or something like that. So he didn't get there. His plans were kind of foiled. He stayed in Georgia, in Atlanta, and other places for quite a while, working with some British gypsies of all people. He was a stable boy. He was tending horses. He learned how to race, and then was like a jockey at county fairs, racing for various people. So already he's a young kid doing some pretty extraordinary things.
Yeah.
But he discovered a year later in 1912, he found himself in Norfolk, Virginia, which, of course, as anyone knows, is a big Navy town and is a big port. And he was able to stow away on a German freighter bound for Europe. I don't even think he knew where it was going. He just knew it was going to Europe, and he stowed away. And he's like, finally, I'm going to get myself to Europe. I'm going to get myself
anywhere but here, right? Get me out
anywhere
of here.
But here. He did not land in Paris, however. He landed in Scotland, and then eventually made his way down to London, and he discovered that he was a good boxer. And so for the next several years, he made a living performing as a boxer and then also performing slapstick with an African-American entertainment troupe. So like, again, already, we haven't even got to this guy's main exploits, but he's already doing he's already has living this extraordinarily colorful life.
Yeah, right. Runs away from home at 11, like has nothing, born into poverty, really difficult home life, runs away, joins travels with a group of gypsies, ends stows away aboard the ship, ends up in Europe. He's traveling. He's a stage comedian. He's a boxer. He's part of a group called Belle Davis's Freedman Pickaninnies, which is quite a name.
Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a name for a troupe. But yeah, exactly. And that's the thing I love about this story, is that every time you're like, oh, wow, that's probably like the climax of the movie. It's like, no,
Yeah.
he's just getting started.
And that's one of the awesome things about this podcast, is that every week you're talking to these sorts of people. I mean, sometimes people have like a seminal moment that defines them as a badass. And then you have other people that you're like, you've been a badass your entire life. Is there any point at which you haven't been a badass? And this is just, he's one of those stories. So he is boxing in London, and one of his fights that he gets assigned to takes place in Paris. And he gets there, has this fight. I don't know how that fight went, but all we know from history is that he's like, I'm not going back. I'm staying. This is where I was trying to get when I was a kid. This is where I'm staying. And he continued to box and worked in a music hall in Paris and was finally kind of fulfilling his dream. And then, of course, World War I hits.
Yeah, he got there in 1913 and loved it. It was just like, I'm staying. And then immediately,
1 year later,
he gets called in to defend his new homeland from the Germans.
And which, of course, if anyone's seen, read their history or even seen, there's lots of movies that even feature this sort of dynamic. I'm thinking of like Legends of the Fall and stuff like that, where Samuel and Brad Pitt sign up to fight because the United States didn't rush into World War I. And so here he is, an American in Paris, and he decides to go ahead and battle the Hun.
Right. And Paris is right in the middle of this, right? 1914, like the Battle of Marne, like their stories were like, and one of the stories that comes out of that is the Germans were so close to Paris that they enlisted the taxi cabs of Paris to drive soldiers to the front line. That's how close they were. They're like, every taxi in Paris was like conscripted to drive soldiers to the front lines of the battle. So this stuff, like he's hearing the artillery shells from his apartment. And,
that's right.
But he's just like, I'm going. All right. He just got there and he's like, yeah, I'm going to go fight these guys.
But of course, he's not French and he's still learning French. And so he can't enlist in the regular army, so he enlists in one of those vaulted establishments that you've heard ever since you're a kid, the French Foreign Legion,
yes,
which is basically a lot of people who band together from other countries to fight for France. It's one of those rare institutions that I don't know if other countries even have an equivalent. The French Foreign Legion is just one of those storied things that I've grown up as a kid.
It's one of the most badass military units in history, right? Like,
totally.
That has this reputation because they would take anybody, right? Like the Foreign Legion, I love the Foreign Legion. I want to do an entire episode on them, but like the general vibe of the Foreign Legion, especially in like the late 1800s, maybe, kind of going into this 1914, was that like, they didn't ask you your name. You didn't have to present any papers. You showed up, you joined the Foreign Legion under any name you wanted. You had to serve for 20 years. They put you in all the most dangerous stuff because they didn't want to sacrifice French lives. The French were officers. You could get to be like an NCO or something. And if you survived for 20 years, you would get a French passport with your fake name on it. And it just basically like attracted all of these like cutthroats and people who were trying to escape. It had this reputation of being real hardcore. Like for a while, there was a law that they weren't allowed to, the members of the Foreign Legion were not allowed to set foot on French soil. Like they couldn't go to mainland France because they were like too dangerous and unruly.
It sounds like I hope Guy Ritchie or Matthew Vaughn listen to this podcast, because it sounds like the kind of movie that one of the two of them could really have a lot of fun with.
The Legion is cool. Yeah, the Legion's great.
And so he becomes an infantryman, and he fights in some of the war's most intense battles. And I should say, by the way, that, as badass as we say the Foreign Legion was, those guys suffered terrible casualties.
Yeah.
Like in 1 year alone, like in 1915, the year he joined, they lost almost like 22,000 soldiers.
Yeah, they put them at the front because then you didn't have to have French soldiers coming home in coffins with French flags on them, right?
Like more than half of them were killed.
Yeah.
And he was almost one of them because he was participating in some of the worst battles of the entire war, including most famously Verdun, which is one of the most cataclysmic battles that was fought on French soil.
It's one of the bloodiest battles in human history. I think it's like second behind Stalingrad.
Yeah. And he almost didn't come out of it because he was severely wounded, shot, I believe, in the leg, and almost didn't make it home. And but that wounding, that destroying his, hitting his leg and almost killing him is the thing that completely changed the trajectory of his life, completely spun it in a completely different, extraordinary direction. And that is the fact that while recuperating, he learned how to fly. He basically decided, if I can't fight from the land, I can do it from the sky. Yeah.
There's a story that he joined the French Air Force on a bet, or he bet somebody he could do it, and they bet against him.
Exactly.
Like he was like $2,000 or something to $2,000, which is a lot of money in these days, or maybe it's equivalent of $2,000. But he told one of the guys in the hospital that he was going to join the Air Force, and the other guy was like, "I bet you won't," and then he bet money that he would, and then he did.
If there's one thing we should learn by now, it's never bet against this guy.
Yes.
Never bet against Bullard.
Mm-hmm. So he joins the Air Force and becomes a member of the French Air Force.
Yeah, joins as an air gunner at first, which is obviously the kind of guy kind of like my position. You're sitting behind the pilot, defending the aircraft. But he received his pilot's license in 1917 and became a full-fledged, like you said, the first African-American fighter pilot in history, American flying for France.
And so how did he do?
So he did pretty extraordinary. He may have been the first African-American pilot flying for France, but he was one of nearly 300 American aviators that were flying for France.
Yeah, they had the Lafayette Corps, I think it was called.
The Lafayette Corps, it's exactly right, the Lafayette Corps. And he took part in 20 missions, I want to say, or more than 20 missions, and is credited with definitely shooting down one and potentially also shooting down 2 German aircraft. And as you said, because of that, we think, one or 2 planes isn't a whole lot, but that is actually there were a lot of pilots who didn't even get that. Mm-hmm. You're responsible for, helping shoot down another aircraft or taking part in it or something like that. But actually getting confirmed kills was very difficult.
Yeah. If you shot the plane a couple times, it didn't necessarily count as a confirmed kill. And these guys are doing other stuff. Like this is World War, like biplanes, right? Red Baron kind of stuff. So you're spotting for artillery. You're dropping bombs on trenches. There's a lot of other missions other than just shooting down enemy aircraft.
Right.
And so he was probably doing a lot of that kind of stuff too. 20 combat missions. There were a lot of aviators who didn't return from their first one.
That's very true. That's very true. And as you said, because of that, he earned the nickname the Black Swallow of Death.
Yes.
And in that sort of vein of the young child who wanted to flee racial discrimination and oppression, he painted on the side of his plane, "All blood runs red," which is just a beautiful sort of acknowledgement of underneath our skin, we are all exactly the same.
Yeah, underneath a heart with a dagger through it.
Yeah, exactly.
I also saw a picture of him standing in front of an airplane with, apparently he had a pet monkey named Jimmy that would fly with him sometime.
Because of course he does.
Why not? So he's a war hero for France, even though he wasn't born there and kind of just moved there a year before the war started. But then the U.S. joins the war in 1917. So a lot of those Lafayette Air Corps guys, they went over and joined the U.S. Air Force.
Sure, that's exactly right.
But Bullard,
and he tried to do that too, but it didn't exactly work because the skin color.
Yeah. So
he went through the medical examination. They told him, I think some bullshit thing about he was too short. Mm-hmm. And we know now based on records and things like that was not the case.
Yeah.
They were only choosing white pilots. So even though here you have a guy who's proven in the air more than 20 missions, potentially 2 confirmed kills, and they said no because of the color of his skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You don't have to train this guy how to do this. He's been doing this, right?
Yeah.
So he stays with France and finishes out the war.
Unfortunately, has a rough. He gets transferred out of the air service by a French officer who he has an actual like knockdown drag out fight with. The officer was engaged in some sort of racist incident with him, and it went to blows, and he got kicked out of the air service. Yeah, exactly, right?
Getting kicked out for insubordination for punching your boss in the face is also badass.
Yeah, is also badass. Yeah, and so he's discharged, but it was at the end of the war anyway. So he's discharged and he returns to Paris. And once again, we have this story of, okay, now this is where the story ends, right? Like he's done all these amazing things. He was the first African-American fighter pilot, yada, yada. No, he doesn't. He moves back to Paris and becomes a jazz drummer in a nightclub named Zelly's, which is the most celebrated nightclub in Montmartre, one of the most famous areas in Paris, the area where you have the Moulin Rouge, for example. Mm-hmm. He travels to Alexandria in Egypt, where he does like this jazz ensemble at a hotel. He continues boxing. He manages musicians. He's an exercise trainer. He's just doing all these amazing things. He gets married to this beautiful French woman, has 2 kids. And eventually, he actually buys a Parisian jazz venue named Le Grand Duc. And it's there that he meets some of the most incredible people in that time of history. I mean, he Josephine Baker, another fellow American expat and later spy and of course amazing, extraordinary singer and dancer and stuff like that. She like babysits his kids.
Yeah,
he becomes friends. He has poet Langston Hughes, who's not yet poet Langston Hughes, doing dishes in the back room. He's working with of course the famous singer and trumpeter Louis Armstrong. He even meets Ernest Hemingway, who is so taken by him that he bases one of his characters on Bullard in The Sun Also Rises, his novel. So it's just amazing. And of course, I should say, and if you've not done an episode on him, you really need to. He also hangs out with the French flying ace Charles Nungesser, who, if you've not done him, was a competitor with Lindbergh for the famous transatlantic race and disappeared potentially somewhere over North America and almost beat Lindbergh, and we would definitely know his name. But talk about another colorful, extraordinary guy. So basically, what we're saying is he is surrounded. He owns this jazz nightclub, and he is surrounded by the who's who of glitterati of Paris and American expats in Paris.
For sure, yeah. And he, he might have served with Rene Fonck, who was like the all-time ace of aces. He was in when he was still in World War I. He was in Escadrille 85, Spy 85, which was where Rene Fonck served. He shot down something like 75 confirmed kills in the war. 75. 140. He claimed 142, but they confirmed 75, which is still more than any Allied pilot, any non-German pilot has ever shot down.
Maybe more than any pilot in war, in history.
And but so that's what we were saying, right? The story gets more and more crazy. He's a decorated war hero. He ends World War I with 15 military decorations, including the Croix de Guerre and the military medal. He becomes a jazz drummer, buys a nightclub. And this is Midnight in Paris time period we're talking about here, right? The Owen Wilson movie. This is where he's living, and this is what he's doing every night. They're going to these clubs, and he's this is pretty big time stuff. But he's still not done with all the badass stuff he's going to do. We have to take another really quick break here, but when we get back, he's on top of he's running one of the most successful nightclubs in Paris. He is a common name. He's drinking martinis with F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. But we're in Paris in the 30s, and some more stuff's about to go down. And after we take this quick break, we're gonna see how Eugene Bullard responds when Germany comes knocking on France's door once again. Welcome back. I am here with Brandon Fibbs. And Brandon, hello. When we last saw Eugene Bullard, he was running the nightclub Le Grand Duc, one of the most successful jazz nightclubs in all of Paris. We are entering the 1930s, and there's a cloud hovering over Europe towards the late 30s.
Yeah, of course. As everyone knows, World War II begins in September of 1939. And once again, Bullard finds himself in Paris, besieged by the Germans. He's 46 years old now, but he just happened to in all of his travels, he picked up German. And so he agreed, the French government requested that he spy on German citizens who hung out in his nightclub, which he agreed to do. And so he was always paying attention to all the sort of clamor and any conversations that might benefit the Allies, and then he would feed that back to French officials.
It's like Casablanca, right? He's
it's exactly like Casablanca. That's exactly it. He's even owning a club. The only thing we don't have is Ingrid Bergman.
Right, exactly. And, he was married to a pretty French woman, so who knows, right?
so who knows? That's exactly right.
Yeah, and, he's there, and you have to imagine that the Germans did not expect that he was understanding what they were saying after Paris falls. And he's there, right? They're in the nightclub. They're talking to each other about whatever they've been up to that day. And he's there hanging out, pretending he doesn't speak German, but he's picking up every word of it.
Which is just, it's just so extraordinary. And of course, as everyone knows, the Germans invaded France, took Paris, and Bullard volunteered. And I'm not sure, and I don't know, Ben, if you came across any reason he doesn't volunteer as a pilot. He volunteers as an infantryman, and once again is a ground pounder with a gun. And I guess maybe that was where he was needed. And so he volunteers as an infantryman fighting in an infantry regiment. And at one point is wounded, and a shell explodes near him. He's once again badly wounded and escapes in his state to Spain, which at this point is neutral in the war. Mm-hmm. And in 1940 manages to get back to the United States for like some recovery time. He goes back to a New York hospital to recover. He has not been back to the United States at this point in 30 years.
Yeah.
And so, of course, he left as a kid. So he's returning to an America that he probably doesn't even recognize. And clearly at this point, like we said, he changed his name, or, he Frenchified everything, because of course he did. That's where he spent the majority of his life. He's more French now than he is American. So yeah, but the problem, of course, is, as you said, in France, he was a known name. Everyone knew who he was. He was celebrated. He was hanging out with A-listers here and there and everywhere. He comes back to New York and nobody knows who he is.
Yeah. Nobody knows who he is. He's not a big war hero. His military decorations are not for the U.S. military. And he's this great hero in this very well-known French, basically celebrity, like runs one of the most successful nightclubs in the city, comes back to Harlem, and he's got to sit in the back of the bus.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, his back injury, the injury that he had injured his back, and so this is the point in the story where unfortunately things take a little bit of a darker turn, because he's looking for work, and it's not as a jazz musician or anything at this point in his life. He's nearly 50, and he works as a longshoreman for a while. He can't do much because of his back injury. He sells perfume. And he eventually becomes a security guard at Rockefeller Center, NBC headquarters. And like you said, he gets this Harlem apartment, which is paid for because of his Paris nightclub, which had been destroyed in the war. He got some financial compensation that paid for the apartment. But at this point, he's just, nobody knows who he is. He's poor. He's hurt, and so there's only so many jobs he can do. But he's continuing in all of his sort of like fighting racism sort of things, and finds himself both, you mentioned, like in the back of the bus, literally in the back of the bus. He was beaten at one point for not giving up his seat near the front of the bus. And then later in 1949, he's at a concert in New York City for a black entertainer, Paul Robeson. And he and a bunch of people are attacked by a racist mob, many of them off-duty cops, and they beat him and a bunch of other people with baseball bats and sent everyone to the hospital. And it was just he basically returned to the America that he had escaped for the exact same reasons that he was, once again in the crosshairs.
Yeah, yeah. And, after the war's over, he can't really, there's not much left for him in France either, because the nightclub, as you said, had been destroyed. He does return at one point. In 1954, they have him relight the flame on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris. He's one of 3 guys that gets to do that because of his status as a war hero there. In 59, they give him the Legion of Honor, which is the highest award in the French military. But he kind of is going back and forth between Paris and New York at this point. And I think that's kind of the end of his story, right? I saw an interview with him He was working as an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center and a security guard there. And there was some late night show host who got wind of what was going on and interviewed him about his career on the show. And Bullard went there, and he's on the show, and he's talking about his experiences. And he's still wearing the elevator operator uniform.
He's in his elevator. Yeah. And the only reason they even found him is because Charles de Gaulle, the French president, came to New York, and he inquired about, hey, where's Bullard? And they were like, we don't know who you're talking about. Yeah. It took the FBI tracking him down and finding him and basically saying, the French president wants to meet with you. And then that caught someone at NBC's eye, and they're like, ooh, who's this guy? And so, yeah, they had him on. And so the guy that they had on, he literally walked out of his elevator in his uniform, sat down on a set, and was interviewed about his life. Now just a humble man living in a humble Harlem apartment, surrounded by pictures of all of his famous friends and all of his 14 war medals and stuff from France, but has now been kind of just reduced to this sort of sad footnote.
Yeah, just completely unknown in the U.S. It's wild, right? Having had such a successful life and such an interesting life. And he remained unknown for a long time. I had been doing Badass for a while, and somebody presented the story to me and said, you should talk about this. And I had no idea about any of it. All of it was brand new to me. So he did end up getting a little bit of recognition in the more recent years. There's been a couple biographies on him. The U.S. Air Force officially commissioned him a second lieutenant in 1994.
That's right. 30 years after his death. So he dies in 1961 of stomach cancer. But he was buried with full military honors in his Legionnaire's uniform in a cemetery in New York that was for French war veterans. So he stayed with that. But like you said, he had been granted just a couple years before his death the Knight of the Legion of Honor, the highest order and decoration that France can even bestow. And then, as you said, in 1994, 33 years after his death, and 77 years to the day after the U.S. rejected him because of his skin color to fly for them, he was posthumously commissioned a second lieutenant in the Air Force.
Wow. Well, that is the story of Eugene Jacques Bullard, someone who we should all know a little bit better, because the story, like you said, it starts wild and it just gets crazier and crazier and crazier.
Ben, do you ever have those moments where you discover I know you have these because you have books. You have a book about this. You have this podcast. Like, history is full of the most dynamic, extraordinary people who did such extraordinary things, and you come across their story and you think, How did I not learn about this person? How was I not taught this in elementary school? Like, there's so many people. You're constantly discovering people. We're constantly unearthing the most extraordinary badasses, to coin a phrase. And I love that when you find one, you know that there are so many more to come. Yeah, it's like you just want to keep digging. Like, get my shovel. I want to keep digging through history because I'm going to keep unearthing these extraordinary people.
It's so true. This story is an example of that for me. I had never heard this before. Somebody had come to me about writing about it. I mean, this was maybe 20 years ago now, 15 years ago now, but it was completely foreign to me when it came out. I was like, oh my God, that's wild. Sometimes you meet these people in the wild, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I used to do this, and then I did that, and then I was here, and then I fought in this war. And you're thinking, are you pulling my leg? Like, are you exaggerating a little, or are you just incredibly interesting person that I've never heard of before?
I discovered him while researching Bessie Coleman, who was the first African-American woman to get a pilot's license. Oh. And it was through her, and she's her own badass episode if you want to do one. Sure. But it was through her that I kind of spun off in this little rabbit trail and discovered him. And then it was just like, all right, I'm off to the races. There are just so many amazing people here that the world desperately needs to hear about.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that is our episode for today. Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always great to have you here.
Absolutely, anytime.
This was a great choice and a great episode, and I feel
thank you, sir.
Very happy that we got to tell this story.
I love it. Thank you.
All right, and thank you guys for listening to it. We really can't do the show without you and without your support. So please do like and subscribe and do all that stuff because it does help the show out. If you want to hear more stuff like this, please email us and let us know. You can find all of our info on the website, badassoftheweek.com. And we will see you on the next one. Stay badass. Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs.
Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.